Thank you for staying with us throughout that break, dear listener. And now we're joined by our last guest for this episode of News and Views. Remember, of course, as always, the floor can be yours to contribute to the discussions that we're having. If you contact us on the studio line 011-680-0355, WhatsApp, of course, you can send us a text message on 061-766-0355. You can reach us on X as well at Salam Media using the hashtag Ramadan 2026 SM. And of course, as always, we are streaming live on Facebook, facebook.com/, Salam Media, and on the website, salammedia.com/listen-live. And of course, last but not least, we are again very privileged to be joined by the renowned writer, activist, and political scientist, Sisonke Msimang. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm fine as well, alhamdulillah. Thank you. And I mean, I'm going to start by asking you the question that our Palestinian uncles and aunties always like to ask when they're speaking to somebody overseas, which is, what time do you have right now? What time is it over there in Australia?
It's exactly 3:41 p.m. That's what time I have.
Oh, wonderful. We have 9:41 in the morning with the day of fasting to come. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, thank you for joining us, Sisonke. So, I'm gonna ask you. A few days ago, I came across the first episode of your new podcast that you created with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation called "Boycott: The Fight to End Apartheid," on the anti-apartheid struggle and the role of international boycotts. So, I mean, I think to start, please tell us about the podcast and the kind of work as well that went into producing it. It was super fascinating, I must say.
Sure. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I've been living in Australia for about a decade now, and I'm a child of the anti-apartheid movement. Very much grew up in the African National Congress as it was back then. And so I know a lot about the anti-apartheid movement. I know about the rallies, the protests, what it took to defeat that horrible beast. I know a lot about the violence, etc. But what I had less of a understanding of is how it played out here in Australia, which is where I now live. And so when I was offered the opportunity to host, I took it, fully. I said, "Wow, this is an excellent example, an excellent opportunity." And so the podcast really takes us through 6 episodes. The first episode, which is out now, really grounds us in what was apartheid and what were the links between apartheid in South Africa and Australian racism. So it talks us through that. But it also interweaves my own story and the story of my father, who was a freedom fighter. Episode 2 looks at sports very specifically. The third episode, and moving on from there, sort of takes us chronologically through till the end of apartheid, officially, obviously, in 1994. So we're really concerned with what are the various aspects that it took to stage a proper boycott. Sports being one, the economy and not buying South African labels being the second, and then obviously the economic sanctions at a wider scale in terms of trade between countries. So that's really the focus of the episodes. And obviously, for obvious reasons, it's very resonant at this particular time, given the thousands and thousands of people who have been killed by the IDF, in Palestine. For me, it just felt like an excellent example of how change happens.
Wonderful. I mean, I should, again reiterate to the listener that I did listen to the first episode, and it is really a very excellent podcast, and it's really well put together. And of course, it explains things in a way that is really accessible, actually, as well, which is often really appreciated. Um, and of course, this sets us up really well. We will come back to boycotts in Palestine in the second half of this interview. We have to go to a short break, but we'd be really grateful if you stay on to continue the discussion afterwards. Thank you. Um,
Across Sudan, starvation is tightening its grip. With rising food prices and widespread malnutrition, 8.7 million people are now facing emergency or famine-level hunger. As the conflict intensifies and aid routes narrow, families in Sudan are running out of options and time. The Al Imdad Foundation is delivering life-saving humanitarian aid to those most at risk. Stand with Sudan. Donate online at alimdad.com or call 0861 786 243 for more information.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness, and every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and freezer card calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031 208 9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
With Ashraful Aid this Ramadan, your zakat changes lives. It feeds families facing hunger, restores dignity to those in need, and brings hope where it is needed most. From food relief to essential support, your zakah reaches communities with care, transparency, and impact. Give with confidence, give with trust. Make your zakah count this Ramadan. Give your zakah to Ashraful Aid and help change lives today.
The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Use the black seed, for indeed it is a cure for every disease except death." This Ramadan, honor that guidance. Tip Black Seed supports your blood sugar during fasting, boosts immunity, sustains your energy from suhoor to iftar. Available at leading pharmacies. Tip Black Seed, your golden drop every day.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042 203 1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
This Ramadan, please consider donating to the Islamic Dawah movement. For over 45 years, IREM has built over 80 masjids and distributed more than 160,000 Qurans in 8 local languages. IREM has installed over 250 boreholes and water wells. Over 1,000 children are fed daily, building strong Muslim communities in disadvantaged areas.
You are listening to Salam Media live from our headquarters in South Africa. This is Salam Media, keeping you company this Ramadan.
Thank you so much, dear listener, and also thank you, of course, thank you, of course, Sisonke Msimang, for staying with us throughout that short break. And I think, moving on to the next thing that I would want to kind of come to is, of course, that in the podcast, they do a really good job, actually, Sisonke and the production team and the research team of contextualizing apartheid in South Africa within this wider history of settler colonialism. Hello, Sisonke, are you back with us?
Hi, apologies. My network was not stable, so I've moved locations. Apologies for that.
No worries at all. It happens to everyone. And we're just happy to have you back with us. I was just saying while we were waiting, is that something that you do really well in the podcast is that you contextualize apartheid in South Africa within kind of this wider history of settler colonialism. In the field of Palestine studies, which is the field that I come from, we have sometimes debates because there's a bit of a tension between applying the framework of apartheid in Palestine versus settler colonialism. And so in the case of South Africa, sometimes it feels that the focus on the kind of 4.5 or so decades of apartheid actually obscures, what came before in terms of settler colonialism. And the fact
Yes.
that many of the things that we live with today that we may refer to as new apartheid or unofficial apartheid or economic apartheid are actually legacies of settler colonialism as well.
Yes.
And so how do
Absolutely.
you kind of, see those two, the relationship between apartheid and settler colonialism?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of the grappling with trying to make something that's accessible to a broad audience, so that people understand the outlines of the story, means that you don't have the capacity to get into the complexity and the detail. So what I would have liked to do, to be honest, is make a 10-episode series that really allows us to talk about colonization. And so we had about 2 sentences in there about the kind of history of settler colonization, of which, of course, apartheid was only the most recent iteration, right? So we had the Dutch, we had the British, we had the 2 contesting over land that was fundamentally not their own. And then of course we had apartheid, where the Dutch won out. So I completely take your point, and I think it is really difficult when you're making a medium for a mass public, particularly in a country that, of course, is itself a settler colony and continues to be one. So those are the difficulties of the choices you have to make.
Absolutely. And I mean, even when we're kind of not making something for a mass audience, I mean, as you probably know, within academia as well, it's sometimes really difficult to kind of characterize this relationship in a way that doesn't kind of privilege one over the other necessarily. But of course, as you say, South Africa had settler colonialism for centuries. It had apartheid for
That's
decades.
Right. That's right. Exactly. And in part, part of the focus on the most recent iteration on apartheid, rather than on the long history of settler colonization, which in some ways, of course, continues. Part of the reason for the focus is because we were talking about the boycott movement. And that one coalesces, of course, around that particular moment for all kinds of reasons we can talk about. But that's, ultimately, that's the storytelling choice that we had to make. Yeah.
No, and absolutely. That makes complete sense. I mean, the title of the podcast ultimately is Boycott with an exclamation mark.
Yeah. With an exclamation mark.
With an exclamation mark. I think it's really important to present that to our listeners. Otherwise, I'd have to be saying the title of the podcast is Boycott. But rather than, I guess, asking you directly how impactful the international boycotts were, I mean, how do you think specific kind of aspects of them were impactful? How in, like, rather than saying how impactful, I want to ask you, in what ways were they impactful? Kind of in the sporting sense or the academic sense. You see, the second episode is about sports. I'm very excited for that, actually. We opened the show this morning by talking about possible boycotts of the World Cup this year. And then kind of just add on to that as kind of a supplementary question is a lot of people, of course, draw parallels between, the anti-apartheid boycotts against South Africa and the BDS movement in Palestine, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which emerged in 2005 as the result of a call from Palestinian civil society to boycott companies and individuals complicit in Israeli occupation. So in what ways do you kind of see these boycotts as being similar? And of course, in what ways do you see them as being different?
Yeah. So I think a few things were very interesting that I hadn't really understood as clearly before starting to do the research on the project. And keeping in mind, of course, it comes in from the lens of Australia and what it did. But one of the key lessons that I think ought to be drawn from the boycott movement here in Australia is how attuned the movement was to the nature of the society here. So that is to say, because Australians really like sports, and in particular have an affinity for rugby and cricket, the activists here understood that that's where you would really affect the public. And I think if they had begun the boycott movement only by looking at products or goods that are made by South Africa, I wonder whether it would have been as effective. So I think the kind of big picture thing here is that the entry point for the boycott movement in Australia was the Springboks rugby tour, because these people like rugby, you know. And it's very interesting because when the Springboks arrived in 1971, the general public in this country was simply saying sports and politics don't mix. So this argument that we hear all the time, even to this day, that sports and culture, sports and politics don't mix. And I think it was polling at something like 86% of the Australian sort of public who were polled about this said that. And that had completely flipped by the end of the tour. Not because they had some sudden epiphany, but because the disruption and the violence that the state leveraged against the protesters was so significant that it made people wonder and ask, what is at stake? What are they defending so much across the world in South Africa? And I wonder what it is that they may be defending here in this place that is worth doing this to young people who are out here protesting a simple sports match. A state of emergency was declared in one of the states here called Queensland, simply to prevent the protesters from protesting a rugby match, which seems excessive. And so I think for me, one of the lessons of a boycott movement is, of course, you're trying to boycott the thing itself. So you're targeting the state and apartheid. But what you are also wanting to do is draw out and illustrate its violence in the process. And because the state is violent, because that's how, because it has to defend so strongly its position, in a sense, there's an inevitability that it will make itself look bad.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important to point out that the sporting and I guess also the academic boycotts were really important. You know, even today, for example, like we were talking about, you know, the possibility of there being boycotts at the World Cup later this year. And I mean, of course, you know, as they say, you know, sports and politics shouldn't mix. But of course, you know, President Donald Trump is also the very first winner of, and probably the only winner to ever have it in history, of the FIFA Peace Prize, whatever that means. And so I don't see how that can be anything other than political.
Exactly.
But another kind of aspect of boycotts, so when we come to, for example, the boycott of Israel, is that many people find it difficult because of the role that Israel plays in very particular industries. So, for example, like microchips for phones and computers, agricultural technology, which I think really is overstated, actually. But still, there seems to be this really big marketing push that Israel is very good at that. And so some pro-Israel voices tell us it's actually unethical, but not just unethical, but even futile. To try to boycott Israel because of the fact that it has this role in producing laptops and phones and, you know, water technology and agricultural technology. I mean, South Africa also made really important, you know, like medical advances, you know, during the apartheid days, and exported certain types of technologies that, you know, would be considered today as indispensable. Like we know, you know, famously, you know, the very first open heart surgery, for the very first human heart-to-heart transplant was done by a South African doctor, right, in 1967. And so what sort of argument do you present to people who make these sorts of arguments that, you know, oh, you know, these are really important contributions and, you know, how could we boycott that? And people will die if they can't have open heart surgery. And I guess the other one as well, of course, is jobs. So, for example, like at the moment in the campaign to, you know, push South Africa to stop exporting coal to Israel, one of the big kind of pushbacks as well, what about jobs for people who work in the coal industry? And I mean, people did lose jobs, you know, as a result of boycotts back then and today. And one of the big arguments as well against BDS by pro-Israel people is that it'll result in job losses for Palestinians, which I mean, I think freedom is better than having a job.
Absolutely. So I'll deal with the job one. I'll deal with the jobs one first because it's easiest and it's, you know, I think it's handily dismissed. During the anti-apartheid movement, the same thing was mounted, you know, in America. You heard people saying constantly, because Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, they were all incredibly against boycotts and made this argument repeatedly that Black South Africans would be the ones who lose. And Black South Africans made it very clear, as have Palestinians, made it very clear that they have no problem with short-term pain if ultimately what is happening is freedom. So if, you know, if we're going to, you know, reduce these arguments to such a short term and such a self-serving set of arguments, I think, you know, those are not serious people. Those are not serious arguments. So I think In every movement, we have to pay very serious attention to the words of those who are being most affected. And if Palestinians are telling us, as they did in 2005, when BDS movement was born in its current, incarnation, telling us that this is what they want, then who is anyone else in the world to then hold themselves back from boycotting, from divesting, from sanctions? That argument simply doesn't wash for me, and I think for many of us who come out of social movements as a way of making change. Again, I think the same is true for the this notion that Israel is so fundamental to these technologies. First of all, I think we need to understand what is the nature of the technologies that Israel says that it's that it is that we think. I'm so sorry. What is the nature of the technologies that Israel is involved in? And many of those are in defense. Many of those are deeply, wounding, violent technologies itself. So I think we have to ask some questions about what it is that, if we're being forced not to pull out of relationships with Israel, what are we being forced to be complicit in? And again, this is PR, this is marketing. We know that a regime always mounts defenses of itself. And we know that ultimately, to disentangle, to isolate, that's the point of a boycott. So whatever mechanisms that can be used to isolate Israel, to say that it cannot continue to exist integrated into a global economy, into culture, into arts, into sports, is the right thing to do.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's a really good way, I think, to end our episode. So we were really lucky to have you, at this point. And of course, just a final reminder to our listeners to actually check out Sisonke's podcast, Boycott, with an exclamation mark, because I don't want to shout into the mic again.
Thank you so much. And
I'm a very loud person. Thank you so much.
And best wishes for the rest of Ramadan.
Thank you so much. It was honestly a pleasure.
My
we will speak
honor
again, inshallah, at some point in the future.
Thank you so much.
That was Sisonke Msimang, a renowned writer, activist, and political scientist. Again, please check out the podcast Boycott on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. You can find it online. It's there for free. And we will again be back to wrap up the show after this very short break. So stick with us, please, dear listener, for the very last segment.